Usually when we think about generating just massive physical power, there's this deeply ingrained, like, universal biological expectation of effort. Like
Right.
if you're trying to break down a heavy jammed door or you're pushing a stalled car out of an intersection, your body instinctively goes into this very specific mode.
Yes, exactly.
You
Yeah.
plant your feet, you drop your center of gravity, you clench your jaw, and you consciously tighten every single muscle fiber in your chest, your back, your arms. I mean, you push with absolute rigid total body tension.
It's the central nervous system functioning exactly as it evolved to, honestly.
Yeah.
Like when faced with a massive external resistance, the brain sends this avalanche of action potentials down the spinal cord.
Wow, an avalanche.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
It recruits every available motor unit to create maximum internal tension. We rely on that rigidity to act as a structural brace against whatever object we're trying to move.
And it feels incredibly logical. I mean, it's binary. You exert massive muscular effort, you feel the burn, and you get massive physical output. It's deeply comforting to our primate brains to feel that sheer willpower and muscular strain are the direct creators of force. But, and this is the crazy part, if you've ever stepped onto a tennis court and tried to hit the absolute cover off the ball using that exact same instinct, you already know the tragic punchline.
It never works.
It literally never works. You swing out of your shoes, you grunt, you flex every muscle in your arm, and the ball just, it floats weakly into the bottom of the net.
Yeah, or it sails into the next zip code.
Exactly. In the biomechanical landscape of high-level kinetic chain sports, trying harder, at least, in the way our biology understands trying, is the absolute worst thing you can do.
It's the ultimate physical paradox, really. The harder you try to muscle a strike, the slower the striking implement actually travels.
Which is just wild. So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking a really fascinating journey into the biomechanics, the anatomy, and the pure unadulterated physics of the modern tennis swing.
And honestly, even if you don't play racket sports at all,
Yeah, that's a good point.
this is fundamentally a masterclass in human physics.
Totally. It's about kinetic energy, structural efficiency, and how our bodies actually interact with objects in motion.
Right.
So our mission today, looking at these incredibly dense sources we've gathered, is to decode the counterintuitive mechanics that separate an amateur who's, sweating and straining for a mediocre result from a professional who looks like they are practically asleep while generating terrifying, explosive power.
The goal here is to completely rewire how you think about effort. We really need to replace the primitive concept of muscular exertion with kinetic efficiency.
I love that, kinetic efficiency.
Because when you isolate the raw data, like the fluid dynamics, the vector geometry, the muscle fiber behavior during the exact milliseconds of a swing, it completely shatters the illusion of how the human body generates terminal velocity.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we can't talk about sending a 58-gram rubber ball flying across a 78-foot court without talking about where the power actually originates. We have to start right at the foundation by debunking the most destructive instinct in sports, which is the idea of using your arm as the engine.
The big arm fallacy.
The big arm fallacy. The analysis we're looking at is brutally uncompromising on this. Using your main arm muscles, your biceps, your triceps, your deltoids, to actively push or swing at the ball is biologically and physically disastrous.
Yes.
But I want to explore the why. Because when you hold a racket, your arm is the only physical connection to the tool. It feels entirely natural to use it as the primary mover.
Well, it feels natural until you look at the architecture of the shoulder joint and the actual demands of velocity.
Okay, walk me through that.
Think about what happens anatomically when an amateur tries to hit hard. They typically lock their glenohumeral joint, that's the shoulder, they tighten their bicep, and they try to swing the racket by driving that rigid arm forward.
Like swinging an axe or something.
Right, they're essentially turning their arm into a heavy, solid wooden club pivoting on a single hinge.
And a heavy wooden club takes a massive amount of energy to swing, but it doesn't actually travel very fast at the tip.
Precisely. The muscles around the shoulder and the upper arm are incredibly strong for lifting or pulling, but they're relatively slow twitch in terms of rotational acceleration over a large arc.
So they just can't physically move fast enough?
They cannot contract fast enough to generate the required terminal velocity at the racket head. You get a sluggish, heavy swing, but the lack of speed is only half the problem. The real catastrophe is what happens at impact.
Because that 58-gram ball isn't just sitting there. It's traveling toward you, carrying its own mass and velocity. It has its own aggressive kinetic energy that you have to somehow collide with.
And nature demands that energy go somewhere.
Right.
When you have a massive physical collision and your arm is rigid, tightly gripping the racket and actively pushing from the shoulder, your locked joints become the deceleration zone.
Oh.
Your arm is acting as a rigid strut. The shock wave of the impact travels straight down the shaft of the racket, bypasses the locked wrist, shoots up the tense forearm, and crashes directly into the delicate tendons of the elbow and the rotator cuff.
So, by tensing up to hit hard, you are actively disabling your body's ability to dissipate force.
Completely.
You're basically turning your own elbow into a shock absorber for a violent car crash. That is the direct mechanical pathway to chronic tendinitis.
Absolutely.
So if the arm isn't the engine, the power has to originate far away from the point of impact. It has to come from the ground, right? Like you push into the earth pushes back, and that force has to travel up through the body before the arm even knows what's happening.
That is the absolute essence of the kinetic chain. It is a strictly ordered biological domino effect.
A domino effect, okay.
Yeah, and it relies entirely on Newton's third law. The sequence begins with leg drive the ground reaction force. You press into the cord, and that vertical force is instantly channeled into turning the heavy mass of the hips. The hips rotate, which pulls the core, which pulls the shoulders.
Yeah.
You are building this massive wave of momentum utilizing the heaviest, most powerful muscle groups in the human body.
Okay, let me try to visualize this because the transition of that energy is where I think most people get lost.
Sure.
Imagine your torso, your core, is this massive, heavy, coiled torsion spring.
I like that.
You've twisted it back, and it's practically vibrating with potential energy. Now imagine your arm is nothing but a dead, floppy piece of thick nautical rope bolted to the top of that spring, and at the very end of the rope is the racket.
The contrast in materials there is exactly right. The rigid, heavy core versus the completely pliable, passive appendage.
So if I violently uncoil that heavy core spring, that dead rope of an arm is going to get absolutely launched forward. The tip of that rope, the racket, is going to break the sound barrier.
Exactly.
But here's the piece that always trips me up. If my arm is genuinely just a floppy, dead piece of rope, how do I aim?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. I mean, I can't aim a dead piece of rope. I can't control the face of the racket if my arm is completely limp.
That is the brilliant paradox you have to navigate. It requires reframing the arm's job description completely.
Okay.
The arm is the transmitter of energy, not the generator. Power is simply the total volume of energy in the system. To understand how that dead rope actually accelerates, you have to look at the physics of a whip, specifically the conservation of angular momentum.
Wait, because a whip doesn't crack just by being swung forward, it cracks because the handle stops.
Yes, exactly. The handle of the whip moves forward rapidly, but then the user violently pulls it back or locks their wrist. It decelerates.
Right.
That sudden braking action at the base of the whip causes the kinetic energy to surge down the flexible length of the leather. As the mass of the moving leather decreases toward the tip, the velocity must exponentially increase to conserve the energy. The body does the exact same thing.
Ah, so the heavy torso rotates forward, but then it rapidly hits the brakes.
Yes, the trink decelerates. And because the arm is completely relaxed, that sudden braking of the massive torso violently whips the relaxed arm forward. That is literally the only way to achieve maximum linear velocity at the racket head.
So the control I'm looking for.
The control you're looking for doesn't come from tensing the arm to steer. It comes from the precise anatomical pathways the joints naturally follow when they're relaxed and the micro-adjustments in your grip.
Wow.
But the moment you try to control the speed by tensing the bicep or the shoulder, you turn the flexible whip back into a heavy wooden club. You kill the kinetic chain instantly.
Okay, so we've established the macro engine, the torso brakes, the relaxed arm whips. We have generated a terrifying amount of raw kinetic energy.
We have.
But if a professional player hits a ball flat with that much energy, swinging a racket at, I don't know, 100 miles an hour, that ball is leaving the stadium.
Oh, without a doubt.
You can't just unleash raw horizontal energy on a court that's only 78 feet long. The physics won't allow it to land in. So how do they keep that massive energy from sending the ball into the parking lot?
They don't restrict the energy. They change the vector of the energy. And that transition from raw, chaotic power to controlled, dipping power is entirely governed by topspin, We are basically taking the massive pool of kinetic energy from our engine and allocating it differently.
Topspin is one of those concepts that everyone talks about, but the biomechanics of how it's actually generated are deeply misunderstood. I'll admit, for years I thought topspin came from like aggressively twisting your waist or rolling your shoulder over the ball at the last second.
A lot of people think that.
Right, I thought it was a rotational movement of the body.
And that is a fundamental misunderstanding of vector geometry. If you utilize aggressive horizontal hip rotation and drive your shoulder through the ball, you are taking all that kinetic energy and directing it straight through the center of mass of the ball. You're creating a massive, flat, horizontal force vector, which, as you noted, will absolutely send the ball flying out of bounds. Topspin cannot be generated by horizontal body rotation. It is strictly dictated by the racket's path through space.
So it's an action versus result distinction. Topspin is a result of a specific physical trajectory, not an action of the body. You don't do topspin, you create the conditions for it.
Exactly. It is the unavoidable result of the low-to-high brushing mechanism. Without a vertical change in the racket's path, you do not have topspin, regardless of how violently you contort your torso.
Let's really dig into the mechanics of that path, because it requires specific physical commitments.
Very specific.
The very first prerequisite before the swing even moves forward is the drop. I mean, you can't brush up if you aren't already below the target.
Right. The racket head must physically drop into a slot well below the intended contact point with the ball. You're creating a runway.
And it's not a tiny dip. To generate the RPMs we see at the high level, that racket head has to plunge down a good 15 to 30 centimeters, roughly 6 to 12 inches below where the ball is going to be.
Which is significant.
Very. If you don't create that vertical deficit, you have no space to accelerate upward. You're just swinging flat.
That runway is essential because the upward swing path is what applies the frictional force. Once the racket is in that dropped position, the kinetic chain uncoils, but the arm's trajectory isn't driving flat. It's driving steeply upward. You are literally brushing from the bottom rear quadrant of the tennis ball aggressively up to the top rear quadrant.
Like taking a stiff brush to the back of a dog's head, starting at the collar and brushing aggressively up to the ears. You aren't punching the dog forward, you are brushing the surface upward.
Great analogy, yeah.
And because the strings have a high coefficient of friction, they grip the felt of the ball.
What's fascinating here is that grip is where the energy splits. This is the vector allocation. Any force applied at an angle can be broken down into distinct directional vectors.
Right. Physics 101.
Right. When you execute this low-to-high swing, you are taking that massive pool of total swing energy from your torso and dividing it. One portion of the energy goes into the forward force vector. This drives the ball over the net. It gives the shot its depth and penetration.
You're gonna punch.
Yes. But the second portion of the energy is channeled into the upward force vector. This energy doesn't push the ball forward at all. It exists entirely to create violent forward rotation. And this is where we run into the beauty of fluid dynamics.
The Magnus effect.
Exactly.
This is pure physics. So when that ball is spinning forward violently, thousands of RPMs, it's traveling through a fluid, because air is a fluid.
Yes, it is.
The felt on the tennis ball grabs the air molecules and drags them along its surface. Because the top of the ball is spinning forward against the oncoming air, it creates a traffic jam of air molecules. It creates a pocket of high pressure on top.
Yeah, right.
But the bottom of the ball is spinning backward, moving with the airflow, which accelerates the air and creates a pocket of low pressure underneath.
And nature abhors a pressure differential. Following Bernoulli's principle, the higher pressure on top physically pushes the ball downward toward the lower pressure, fighting against the natural arc of gravity.
It acts as a literal safety rope. It physically sucks the ball violently back down into the court. This just blew my mind when I finally understood it, because it explains the great secret of professional racket sports.
It does.
This is why a pro can swing with absolute maximum homicidal intent, swinging exponentially harder than an amateur, and yet they never miss a long.
Because the physics scale perfectly. The more violently they uncoil the kinetic chain, the faster the racket head brushes up the back of the ball. The faster the brush, the higher the RPMs. The higher the RPMs, the more aggressive the pressure differential, and the harder the Magnus effect pulls the ball down.
That is just brilliant.
It's a beautifully self-regulating system. The extreme violence of the swing generates the exact physics required to contain and control that violence.
Okay, so we need the kinetic engine for total energy, and we need the low to high path to allocate energy into the Magnus effect.
Right. But to maximize that upward friction, to really get the racket head to whip vertically, we have to look at the absolute tip of the kinetic chain, We have to talk about pronation.
Yes. Pronation is arguably the most misunderstood micro-movement in biomechanics. It is where human anatomy negotiates with the laws of physics at the bleeding edge of the whip.
Let's define it anatomically first, so we aren't just using buzzwords. What exactly are the bones doing during pronation?
Pronation is the internal rotation of the forearm. If you hold your right hand out in front of you as if you were holding a mug of coffee, your palm is facing to the left, your thumb is up.
Got it.
Now, without moving your elbow or your shoulder, just rotate your forearm so your palm is facing flat to the ground, as if you were pouring the coffee out.
So the bones are literally crossing over each other.
Yes, the radius bone rotates over the ulna. That internal twisting of the forearm architecture is pronation.
So in the context of hitting a tennis ball, it's the movement that makes the racket face flip over after contact, like a windshield wiper sweeping across the glass.
Okay, I'm going to push back here based on our earlier physics rules. If I want maximum topspin, and I know pronation accelerates the racket head vertically, I should just consciously, aggressively twist my wrist and forearm inward right at the exact moment I hit the ball, right? Just actively muscle that twisting motion to generate massive spin.
You would think so, but doing that triggers a massive flashing red warning light in biomechanics.
Oh.
Yeah. If you intentionally, actively use your forearm muscles to wring the towel, if you fire those local muscles to force the rotation, you're going to cause severe structural damage to your wrist and elbow.
But why? If the racket needs to flip over and my muscles are capable of flipping it, why is it dangerous to make it happen?
It comes back to the speed of the collision and the neuromuscular limits of the human body. Remember how the kinetic chain works? The heavy torso acts as the brake, and the relaxed arm is the whip.
Right.
The massive momentum of your body is flowing down into your arm. If you suddenly consciously tense your forearm muscles to actively twist the racket right as you collide with a heavy, fast-moving ball, you are instantly stiffening the very end of the whip. You are creating a rigid anatomical roadblock right at the point of maximum velocity and impact.
Oh. You're turning the tip of the whip back into a piece of wood right as it hits the wall.
Exactly. The sheer physical force of the heavy racket's momentum colliding with the ball's mass will overwhelm the small, actively contracted muscles in your forearm. The forces will literally shear the tendons.
Ouch.
Yeah. Active muscle contraction is simply too slow and too rigid to handle the microsecond violence of that collision.
So if I'm not supposed to actively twist my arm, how on earth does the windshield wiper finish happen? How do I pronate?
It has to be a passive, natural release.
Yeah.
It is driven entirely by inertia and the anatomical limits of your shoulder. Go back to your dead rope analogy. The torso uncoils and breaks. The relaxed arm whips forward and upward to brush the ball. Because the arm is completely relaxed as the racket head accelerates up and across the body, the sheer momentum of the 300-gram racket head will physically pull your relaxed forearm into pronation.
So the heavy head of the racket wants to keep traveling, and since my shoulder joint can only go so far, the easiest way for the arm to follow that momentum is for the forearm to just roll over. It's the path of least resistance.
Precisely. The pronation is a physical inevitability of a relaxed arm at the end of a violent kinetic chain. The racket flips you. You do not flip the racket.
I love how this structures the entire philosophy of striking. Let me try to summarize the relationship. The macro engine, the legs, hips, and core, is the freight train. That generates the massive pool of energy.
Right.
The micro element pronation, the tiny crossing of the radius and ulna, is the steering wheel, and the final accelerator at the tip of the whip. They are utterly codependent.
They absolutely cannot exist without each other in a high-level swing.
Because if you don't use your macro engine, if you just stand there and twist your arm, pronation is useless. It has no power behind it.
Right.
But if you use the massive macro engine, but you lock your wrist and prevent the micropronation, the massive engine's power just jams up into your arm and never accelerates the racket head. The macro generates the force, the micro releases it.
And understanding that release brings us to one of the most mind-bending paradoxes in striking mechanics.
Okay, here we go.
We just spent all this time establishing that pronation is the secret to extreme topspin. It's the angular accelerator that allows the racket to brush up the ball.
Right.
So logically, what happens when a player wants to hit a completely flat shot, 130-mile-per-hour flat serve, or a penetrating flat baseline drive where they want almost zero topspin? Do they stop pronating? Because the physics demand the exact opposite.
Wait, how is that possible? How can the exact same anatomical movement that creates maximum topspin be even more necessary when you want no topspin?
To understand this, we have to look at the geometry of the grip and the exact angle of the racket face. Let's analyze a massive flat serve. When a high-level player hits a serve, they don't hold the racket like a frying pan. They use a continental grip.
Which means they are holding the racket handle essentially like a hammer. If you were going to pound a nail into a wall with the thin edge of the racket frame, you'd be using a continental grip.
Exactly. So imagine the kinetic chain uncoiling. The player is exploding upward, the relaxed arm is whipping toward the ball at over 100 miles an hour, and they are holding the racket like a hammer. If the arm simply swings straight forward without any internal rotation, the thin edge of the racket frame is going to slice directly into the ball.
The meat cleaver problem. You're leading with the rim.
Right, and you can't hit a tennis ball with the rim. So in the literal milliseconds before impact, the relaxed forearm must execute an impossibly violent explosive pronation. The radius bone has to snap over the ulna, internally rotating the entire forearm to instantly turn that meat cleaver into a fly swatter. It snaps the flat string bed perfectly square to the back of the ball.
It's squaring the face at the very last microsecond. So what is the difference physically between pronating for topspin and pronating for a flat blast? Because it's the exact same twisting of the bones.
The difference is the spatial trajectory of the arm and the timing of the energy transfer. Let's contrast them. In a topspin shot, the arm is traveling on a steep vertical path, low to high. The pronation acts as an angular accelerator. It rolls the racket head over the ball, maximizing friction and rotational energy. The glancing blow.
But in the flat serve,
In the flat serve, the arm is driving the racket linearly, straight through the ball. The pronation isn't brushing the ball, it is snapping the face square to maximize linear energy transfer. It is taking all the rotational velocity of the arm and dumping it straight through the ball's center of mass.
wow.
And just as importantly, it is a deceleration mechanism. If you swing a racket straight forward at 130 miles an hour and don't allow your forearm to pronate naturally, your elbow hinge will hyperextend and your shoulder will tear out of its socket trying to stop the momentum. Pronation allows the arm to safely fold and spiral, dissipating that massive straight-line kinetic energy across the body.
It's basically a universal requirement for joint safety. Now, since we are deep in the weeds of wrist and forearm anatomy, we absolutely have to address the massive elephant in the room regarding racket sports.
Yeah.
Badminton. We have to talk about badminton players transitioning to tennis because the anatomical movement of pronation in badminton is identical, but the physical application is dangerously different.
It is a phenomenal case study in mass, inertia, and force generation. We really have to look at the raw metrics to understand why the biomechanics diverge so wildly.
Let's lay out the numbers. A badminton shuttlecock weighs approximately 5 grams. The racket weighs about 80 to 90 grams.
You are essentially swinging a feather attached to a hollow twig.
Right. Now compare that to tennis. A tennis ball is 58 grams. That is more than 10 times heavier than a shuttlecock. And a tennis racket is roughly 300 grams. We are dealing with an entirely different universe of mass and inertia.
And those differences completely rewrite the rules of engagement for the muscular system. Let's look at how a badminton player pronates. Because the mass of the racket and the projectile are incredibly low, the physics allow for and actually demand a completely different power source. Badminton players can and do rely on active, explosive small muscle contraction.
Wait, you mean the exact thing we just spent 10 minutes saying will destroy a tennis player's arm?
Yeah.
Active muscular twisting.
Yes, because force equals mass times acceleration. When the mass is near zero, the force required to accelerate it is minimal. In badminton, to generate blinding speed over a distance of a few inches, players actively and violently fire their forearm flexors and wrist muscles to flick or snap the racket head into pronation. They use local, fast-twitch muscles to create instant acceleration, hit the 5-gram shuttlecock, and then actively break the racket.
It's like snapping a wet towel. It's a sharp, muscular flick.
Exactly. Because the mass is so negligible, their joints, tendons, and cartilage can easily handle the sudden acceleration, the sudden braking. It's highly efficient for that specific microenvironment.
But here's the massive warning sign.
Yeah.
If you are a high-level badminton player, your central nervous system is hardwired to fire those active pronation muscles when you want power.
Yes.
If you step onto a tennis court and try to apply that exact same neurological program,
It is catastrophic. If you bring that active, forced, muscular snap to a heavy 300-gram tennis racket and use it to collide with a dense 58-gram rubber ball traveling at you, the physical forces are utterly unforgiving.
what actually fails first in the anatomy?
The opposing physical forces, the massive momentum of the heavy racket suddenly being wrenched by small forearm muscles colliding with the massive force of the heavy ball, will invariably shred the TFCC,
The TFCC.
the triangular fiber cartilage complex. It is a crucial, delicate cartilage structure in the wrist that stabilizes the bones during rotation. If you try to actively muscle a 300-gram object into a heavy collision, you will tear that cartilage.
Oh, man.
You will tear the extensor carpi radialis brevis tendon in the elbow. The small muscles simply cannot override the massive momentum at play. In tennis, as we established, you cannot flick. The pronation must be an involuntary passive release that respects the sheer inertia of the heavy racket.
It is such a vivid illustration of why you can't just copy how something looks without understanding the underlying physics of the materials involved. And speaking of copying how things look, this brings us to the great tragedy of the amateur tennis player. They watch the pros on TV in slow motion. They see that glorious windshield wiper finish, the racket completely flipped over after the shot, and they try to consciously manufacture it. And in doing so, they completely ruin their contact with the ball. Why? It all comes down to the microscopic reality of time.
It is the ultimate visual illusion of the sport. Amateurs are trying to replicate the visual end of a physical process right at the beginning of it.
Let's talk about the most terrifying metric in sports physics, the window of impact. When you swing a tennis racket at a ball, how long is the ball actually physically touching the string bed?
0.0004 seconds, 4 milliseconds.
That is a duration of time so infinitesimally small that human conscious reaction is physiologically impossible.
It really is.
Like your nerve conduction velocity, the time it takes for a physical sensation in your hand to travel up your arm, reach your brain, be processed, and for a command to travel back down to your muscles is roughly 200 to 250 milliseconds.
Which means by the time your brain even registers that the ball has touched the strings, the ball is already 3 feet off your racket and traveling back over the net.
Wow.
Whatever happens during that 4 millisecond window is entirely the result of physics and geometry that were set in motion long before impact. You simply cannot make micro adjustments during contact.
And this is where the amateur makes their fatal error. Let's call it the wiping fallacy. Because the amateur sees the pro's racket wipe over after the shot, they think, I need to wipe the racket over the ball while I'm hitting it to get that massive topspin.
Right.
So right at that 0.004-second moment of impact, they actively twist their wrist, trying to wipe the racket flat over the top of the ball.
It is a catastrophic misunderstanding of the physics of contact.
What actually happens to the geometry of the shot when they do that?
Because they are actively twisting the racket face downward during that tiny impact window, the string bed closes prematurely. Instead of staying vertical and brushing up the back of the ball to create the Magnus effect, the strings effectively clap down on top of the ball.
Like trying to slam a lid onto a boiling pot.
Precisely. They smother the kinetic energy. All that forward momentum from the torso is driven straight down into the dirt.
Yeah.
The ball either plows straight into the bottom of the net, or if it manages to glance off the frame, it floats weakly into the midcourt with absolutely zero forward penetration. It's a fake topspin motion that strips the ball of all its linear energy.
So if trying to wipe during impact destroys the shot, what is the actual physical progression of the racket face during those 4 milliseconds and immediately after?
The correct contact zone relies on a concept called extension. Let's break down the micro timeline of a high-level strike.
Yeah.
As the racket drops low and accelerates upward, right at the exact moment of contact, those 0.004 seconds, the racket face must be almost perfectly vertical. It might have a tiny, imperceptible 5-degree forward tilt, but essentially it is flat.
It has to look the ball dead in the eye to absorb the mass.
Yes. The ball compresses against the strings. The strings deform backward like a trampoline, and the ball leaves. But the racket's job is not over. The racket face must then extend forward and upward along the target line for another 20 to 30 centimeters.
I've heard this described as pushing through ghost balls. You hit the real ball and you keep driving that vertical racket face through 2 or 3 imaginary balls lined up perfectly in a row ahead of it.
That extension through the ghost balls is what guarantees depth, weight, and penetrating power. You are maximizing the transfer of linear momentum before the racket deviates from the target line.
Right.
Only then, after the racket has traveled a full foot past the initial impact point, after the ball is completely gone, only then does the inertia of the heavy racket head pull the relaxed arm into pronation. The racket naturally flips over and wipes across the body as a deceleration mechanism.
I want to milk an analogy here because visualizing that delay is critical. Imagine you are standing in front of a heavy cardboard box resting on a slick table, and your goal is to shove it as far across the table as possible. You don't put your hands on the box, give it a tiny tap, and immediately fold your arms up across your chest. the box wouldn't go anywhere.
You wouldn't transfer any sustained force
Huh.
into the mass of the box.
Right. If you want the box to fly, you put your hands on it and you push your arms straight forward, extending as far as you physically can reach, transferring every ounce of your body weight into that box. And only after the box is rapidly sliding away from you, only when you literally cannot reach any further, do your arms naturally fold up, drop down, and relax. The tennis swing is obeying the exact same physics. You push vertically and horizontally through the ball, and the wiping finish is just how your arms naturally fold up after the job is done.
The windshield wiper finish is the exhaust of the engine, not the combustion.
The exhaust, not the combustion, that perfectly encapsulates it. And this naturally brings us to the final and perhaps the most important foundational secret to this entire biomechanical puzzle. We've talked about the kinetic chain, we've talked about relaxed arms, passive pronation, vector allocation, and extension.
We have.
But none of that matters if the physical connection between you and the tool is flawed. How do you actually hold the racket? This brings us to the physiology of the loose to firm rule.
This is the bridge between abstract physics and actual muscle fiber physiology. This is where theory becomes physical reality.
We mentioned at the very beginning of this deep dive that human instinct screams for tension. If you want to hit a heavy object hard, you instinctively tense your muscles in advance to brace for the impact. Why does this deeply ingrained biological instinct completely sabotage a kinetic chain?
Because of what muscular tension actually represents within a mechanical system. Muscular tension is internal friction.
Internal friction.
Think about the anatomy of your arm. When you squeeze the racket grip tightly, the flexor muscles in your forearm contract. When those flexors contract, they neurologically signal the bicep and tricep to co-contract to stabilize the elbow joint. When the upper arm locks, it signals the deltoids and the pectorals to lock the shoulder.
It's an uncontrollable chain reaction of anatomical stiffness.
Exactly. You are literally turning your fluid, highly articulated joints into rigid, rusted hinges. And what did we establish about the kinetic chain? It relies on the arm acting as a completely flexible whip. A tight, rigid arm cannot whip.
It just can't.
It loses the physiological lag that is absolutely necessary to multiply the rotational velocity generated by the hips and torso. If you squeeze the grip, all the rotational kinetic energy from your body just hits a wall of tense, unyielding muscle and dies right there in your shoulder.
If we dive into the muscle physiology behind this, it relies on a concept called the stretch shortening cycle, or the SSC. This is the biological secret to explosive power, and it explains why the muscles must remain loose. Can you explain how the SSC functions at a cellular level?
It is a fundamental viscoelastic property of human tissue. Inside your muscles, there are proteins like titin that act as microscopic springs, and you have tendons that attach muscle to bone, which are highly elastic. Think of a thick rubber band. If you want a rubber band to snap violently, you don't start with it thick, bunched up, and rigid. You start with it loose, and then you rapidly pull it taut. That rapid stretching action stores immense elastic potential energy in the tissue.
And when the stretch reaches its limit, the nervous system triggers an involuntary stretch reflex, and the muscle snaps back with exponentially more force than if you had just consciously flexed it from a standstill.
Exactly. The stress shortening cycle dictates that for a muscle to contract with maximum explosive velocity, it must first be rapidly lengthened or stretched while in a completely relaxed state.
Wow.
In the tennis swing, as your heavy torso rotates forward toward the net, your arm must be completely relaxed so that your pectoral and anterior shoulder muscles can be violently stretched backward by the lagging dead weight of the heavy racket. If your chest and arm muscles are already tense and clenched because you are gripping the racket tightly, they cannot be stretched. They are already shortened. You lose all of that free, massive, elastic energy.
So if I'm holding the racket in a death grip during my backswing, my muscles are already bunched up, they can't stretch, they can't store potential energy, and my swing will be entirely reliant on slow, conscious, robotic muscle contraction.
Precisely. You are fighting your own physiology. You're driving with the parking brake on.
Okay, let's walk through the exact grip pressure timeline because it is highly specific, it fluctuates wildly in a matter of milliseconds, and it requires incredible mental discipline to execute. We'll use a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is dropping the racket on the floor and 10 is crushing the carbon fiber handle into dust.
Sounds good.
Step 1. Preparation in the backswing. The ball is coming toward me.
During preparation, as you are taking the racket back, the grip pressure must be a 2 or a 3 out of 10. It is entirely loose, you are barely holding on, your fingers are soft, your forearm is completely pliable. This ensures the shoulder and chest muscles remain relaxed and ready to be violently stretched by the SSC.
Step 2. The forward swing. My core uncoils, the racket drops into the vertical slot.
The grip must remain a 2 or a 3. This is the hardest part. You must actively fight your primate urge to clench as the racket accelerates. You are letting the heavy 300-gram racket head drag behind your pulling torso, maximizing that elastic stretch. Your arm should feel like a dead weight being dragged through water.
Step 3. The 0.0004-second impact window, the collision.
This is the singular explosive exception to the rule of relaxation. For that microscopic fraction of a second, as the 58-gram ball collides with the strings at high speed, there's an instantaneous involuntary clench. Your grip spikes to a 7 or an 8 out of 10. Your core locks.
Wait, why do I tense up now? If tension ruins the whip, why tighten at impact?
Because of the violent physics of the collision itself. If your hand is completely loose at a 2 out of 10 during impact, the immense force of the ball, especially if it hits slightly off-center, will instantly twist the racket in your hand. The racket will absorb the energy instead of returning it, ruining the shot and potentially spraining your wrist.
Ouch, okay.
You must solidify the structural integrity of the frame against the mass of the ball. This tension must be reactive, instantaneous, and incredibly brief. It is a microsecond stabilization to prevent torsion, not a prolonged muscular push.
Like a high-end shock absorber suddenly firming up to take a massive pothole, but then instantly softening again. Which leads to step 4, the follow-through. The ball has compressed, extended through the ghost balls, and left the strings.
The absolute instant the ball is gone, the grip pressure must plummet back down to a 2 or a 3. Immediate, total relaxation.
Why is the immediate release so critical?
Because of energy dissipation. If you stay clenched at an 8 out of 10 after the ball is gone, your arm remains a rigid strut. All of that violent residual kinetic energy carrying the racket forward has nowhere to go. It will crash straight into the tendons of your elbow and the labrum of your shoulder, slowly tearing them apart over time. Releasing the tension allows the arm joints to safely fold and decelerate. And crucially, dropping back to a 2 out of 10 is what physically permits the inertia of the racket to pull the forearm into that passive windshield wiper pronation. You physically cannot passively pronate a rigid, clenched arm.
So the entire secret to striking a physical object with the terrifying force of a professional athlete is a timeline of absolute, disciplined relaxation, punctured by a single millisecond of violent tension, instantly followed by total relaxation again. Loose, firm, loose. It is a biological symphony of timing.
That's a great way to put it.
So what does this all mean for you? If you've tracked with us through this deep dive, we started by examining the biological instinct of effort, the idea that gritting your teeth and muscling a heavy object is the only way to bend the physical world to your will.
Right.
But what the biomechanics, the fluid dynamics, and the muscular physiology of the modern tennis swing reveal is that high-level striking, high-level physical output is essentially a grand illusion.
It really is.
The violence we see on the court, the 100-mile-an-hour forehands whipping through the air, the 130-mile-an-hour serves, they are not the result of brute muscular force. They are the result of extreme disciplined relaxation. They are the result of building a massive engine with the heavy parts of the body, creating a perfect sequential energy transfer through a loose kinetic chain, and then humbly getting out of the way.
Just letting it happen.
It is about trusting physics, allowing the invisible forces of passive pronation, elastic potential energy, and the fluid dynamics of the Magnus effect to do the heavy lifting for you.
It represents a profound philosophical shift. You are no longer trying to forcefully conquer the ball. You are merely setting up the precise physical conditions, the perfect vector geometry that make the explosive outcome completely inevitable.
You build the engine, you let the whip snap, and you let physics take over. Before we wrap up, I want to dwell on a thought that this entire mechanical deep dive naturally provokes.
It raises an incredibly compelling question that extends far beyond the baselines of a tennis court. We spent this time analyzing how absolute physical relaxation allows for maximum energy transfer in a biomechanical system. How holding on loosely, refusing to force the issue, is the only way to achieve explosive power.
Yeah.
But consider this dynamic applied to our internal lives. How much of this loose to firm to loose philosophy governs high-pressure cognitive tasks? Think about complex creative problem solving or navigating a massive crisis at work. Does tensing up, early panicking, forcing a solution, tightly gripping a single idea, does that destroy our mental kinetic chain?
That is a fascinating parallel because we all know that feeling of mental tension. When you are staring at a blank screen or trying to solve a complex coding problem, the instinct is to push harder, to furrow your brow, clench your jaw, and force the brain to produce the answer.
Wait,
But just like muscling the tennis ball, forcing the cognitive output usually results in rigid, clunky, uninspired ideas.
exactly. When you mentally clench, you are likely activating the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response. You narrow your focus, which is great for running from a predator, but terrible for lateral thinking. By gripping the problem too tightly, you might be preventing the disparate, relaxed parts of your subconscious, your cognitive kinetic chain, from whipping together to deliver that sudden flash of insight.
It makes you wonder if true intellectual or creative power requires the exact same discipline as the physical swing. The discipline to stay completely, confidently relaxed, to gather information, let the subconscious build momentum, and resist the urge to force a conclusion until the exact necessary moment of impact.
The eureka moment is almost always a passive release of built-up cognitive potential,
Yeah.
usually happening when we are completely relaxed in the shower or out for a walk. It is the mental windshield wiper finish.
The physics of the body perfectly mirroring the physics of the mind. Do we block our own brilliance by trying to muscle the answer? It's a phenomenal concept to carry with us. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible deep dive into the hidden mechanics of kinetic energy, biomechanics, and the illusion of effort. We hope you carry this new lens of physical efficiency, vector allocation, and disciplined relaxation into whatever challenges, physical or mental, you face today. Until next time.